This is Demetria Spinrad.
And this is Isaac Meyer.
And you're listening to Criminal Records Podcast, a podcast about some of the weirdest cases in true crime history. And we've got a kind of an overview episode again in this one, right? Because I'm assuming each individual case in this would just be a massive bummer.
Yeah, so we're going to do something I had an inspiration, I guess you'd call it, to do a few months ago. I was trolling JSTOR as one does, and came across a couple of academic articles on the history of medicine in Japan, and specifically on the history of abortion. And I figured, oh, hey, that's topical. And this could be really interesting. And so, maybe we could, from the perspective of the modern United States, maybe learn something by looking at a very different kind of place and time in history and seeing some of the same debates that you see in American politics, but had in a very different framing.
All right, great. This is a topic I have tried to approach in several scripts and then bummed myself out a lot and was unable to continue. So hopefully this sort of extra level of talking about it happening in a different place and time might help me get through this topic.
Yeah, so I think that's a good segue into, just before we get started, just a heads up, folks. I'm going to be talking about abortion law. Obviously, mostly focused on the legal side of it. Still going to be talking about some of the case law, like specific cases. And it can be a bit of a bummer. So just, heads up on that. And obviously, take care of yourselves first and foremost.
I'm assuming that any discussion of abortion law is going to include some references to some really rough stuff about sexual assault and also possibly miscarriage. So just general content warning that I'm assuming that's going to be in here.
Less of the first, thankfully, but more because there's not really a lot of case law in those instances in Japan. So, with that said, let's go back to the beginning. What do we know about abortion in Japanese history before 1868 and the formation of the modern Japanese state? Honestly, it's challenging to know much. The first recorded mention we have of it is from a document that's about 1,000 years old, a text on Chinese medicine presented to the Emperor of Japan and his court in 984 called the Ishinho, or Way of Healing. Which talks a bit about procedures, like abortion procedures in traditional Chinese medicine. There's also fragmentary mention in later court records, like regulations around if a woman of the court has an abortion. Obviously, there's some blood produced by that. Shinto has very strict blood taboos, so when are they allowed into holy sites? When are they allowed into the presence of the emperor? All that stuff is mentioned in court records. We know that by the Tokugawa period, by the early modern period of Japan, when the country is unified under a somewhat centralized feudal government, abortion was practiced throughout Japan. We know that wealthier families would often rely on herbs rooted in Chinese medicine as a way to perform abortions. Apparently, you can also do it with acupuncture. I'm not quite sure how, and really don't want to think too much about it.
Depending on where you stick the needle, you probably can, yes.
But somewhat interestingly, less wealthy families, we also know that they obviously would try to engage in family planning as well, but didn't have access to expensive imported Chinese medicine. So they would rely on things like cold water baths as a way to try and induce shock. One that I found that I really loved was eating raw squid. Also vinegar or spicy food as a way to cause diarrhea and thus cause a pregnancy to fail.
Just sort of get the baby right out of there with the most shocking food you can consume.
That appears to be the plan. Yeah.
I shouldn't say baby, the fetus.
So, from what we can tell, particularly for wealthier families, abortion frankly fulfills a pretty similar role to modern family planning. During the period of during the Tokugawa period, the economy is growing, standards of living are raising, but as you might be familiar with if you looked at modern demographics, that means having a kid is more expensive because you can't just take little Jiro when they're 9 and put him out into the farm. You have to educate them and teach them how to read and write and all that stuff. It becomes pricey.
So before we get too far into the early modern period, I do want to ask, what is going on here politically and religiously that's making abortion so tolerated? Because I do know that in the Western world, especially before what was then called quickening, basically being able to feel the fetus's movements, the pregnancy generally in throughout a lot of history, that pregnancy was considered sort of different, both spiritually in many cases and just practically, because women tend to lose a lot of pregnancies very early in pregnancy. Was the same thing happening in Japan?
Very much so. So, to the extent there are objections to abortion, they're from one of two places. There are some Buddhist objections on moral terms, but those are largely to a related practice. Infanticide was depressingly common for this period, for those who couldn't afford access to abortion. And there's a lot of very direct condemnation of that, but using language that is somewhat ambiguous, and could arguably refer to abortion as well, but the focus is way more on infanticide. More directly, there is a lot of state rhetoric against the termination of pregnancy, but for deeply cynical regions, not for religious ones. The economy during this period is overwhelmingly agrarian, and so, more farmers means more food, means more money, so the more farmers, the more better. And so the perception of a lot of the kind of samurai bureaucrats who are trained to be trying to extract as much tax revenue from the state as possible is this is bad because it basically hurts the bottom line because these people don't become farmers.
Okay, so for political and religious purposes, this is not something that is considered the taking of a life. However, for economic purposes, it is the taking of a potential worker.
Yes, more importantly, the taking of a potential taxpayer.
And that's what's really important about your life, folks.
Yeah, we don't want to lose sight of what really matters here, which is the ability to produce money to pay taxes. And so there are bans on abortion put in place, for example, by the third shogun Iemitsu in 1646, which cover the city of Edo. But first, you have to remember the country is decentralized at this point. There's a national administration led by the shogun in terms of foreign policy, but there isn't even really a unified national economic policy. The various daimyo, the feudal lords, set policy in their own domains. So it's very inconsistent, and even within Edo, it's not really enforced. After that ban, there are still references to the practice in prose and poetry. Clearly nobody's worried about upsetting a censor by talking about this just happening. It's not really being enforced.
So do we even have a record of anyone considering how this ban could be enforceable? Because that is the thing about abortion, is especially in societies that are doing it at home and not through doctors, especially if the concept of a doctor is a little bit less regulated. How on earth do you tell the difference between a miscarriage and an abortion legally?
That is part, the idea that this is at all enforceable becomes pretty laughable very quickly for exactly that reason. Most of the people dealing with kind of prenatal care are midwives, a role that's not really regulated. There are guilds for this, but those guilds are self-regulating. Here's the thing with the Tokugawa period. It's one of the things I love about the Tokugawa period. No policy ever fails. You can never admit that a policy is not working. So instead, just like with the sumptuary laws where you're we're going to make the peasants stop wearing nice clothes, and then they don't do that. And all the samurai are oh, they just stop talking about that law. They just kind of they pretend they're just okay, we're done with that now. It's not a thing anymore. You never repeal anything or admit, oh, this policy isn't working. You just pretend it never happened and hope everyone forgets.
So it's kind of the exact opposite of common law. It is uncommon law.
Extremely uncommon law. The only laws that really matter are the ones that we all kind of know are actually being enforced, which is not the rest of the law.
All right.
I do want to note, actually, that there were two domains in the Tokugawa period that succeeded at actually bringing abortion rates down before the population levels off around 1700, which is, by that point, kind of everyone is wealthy enough that medical access to abortion is fairly regularized. Um, and becomes a way of like family planning to avoid subdivision of assets, being able to educate your kids and financially support the ones you can afford to have. So abortion is pretty common, except in Yonezawa and Kagoshima domains, which actually do find a policy that succeeds in bringing down abortion rates. You want to guess what it is?
Is that policy just not recording abortion rates?
No, actually, it's like a genuine policy of financial support for families and working to grow the economy so there's enough jobs for everyone to go around.
Oh, I was being a complete cynic and thinking that they were messing around with the numbers instead of actually
No, we'll get to that part later.
Families. Okay.
We'll get to that part later. No, those two domains, actually, the governments did try to focus on the kind of economic side of policy, and thus they did have lower abortion rates, because it turns out actually like making it financially feasible to have kids works pretty well at getting people to have kids.
Isaac, are you suggesting that welfare is a way to lower abortion rates? Are you hinting at that, sir?
I know it's basically communism, and that's the one thing we have to protect children from at all costs, even at the cost of their existence.
I know that we usually wear our politics on our sleeve in this show, but like, yeah, I don't think anyone is going to be surprised to know that we are pro right to abortion.
Yeah, spoilers, the moral of this story is going to be, like, even if you don't like abortion, people should have access to it because you're not going to stop them from getting it. Sorry, I guess you can turn the episode off now. You know how it's going to end. Anyway. All
right, yeah, 10 minutes. Tight 10, we're done. Let's go.
But if you want more detail in terms of what happens next, so in 1868, the feudal system comes tumbling down. The national government comes together into the kind of first modern nation state in Japanese history. That new government, in turn, passes the first national abortion law in December of 1868, which is the Sanba no Baiakusewa Oyobi Dataito no Torishimariho, the law regulating the sale of drugs and the practice of abortion technique by midwives, which is part of the first wave of revision of the criminal code.
Okay, in fairness, from what I know about a lot of early medicines that could be used in abortions, a lot of them are poisons, and it's really all about the dosage, and even then you're taking significant risks. Is the same thing happening here?
Yes, and actually that is the only law. That like the law isn't even really about abortion. It's about what happens if you basically help someone get an abortion and accidentally kill them. The law is imported from Imperial China. At this point, Japan is basically just copying China's criminal code, where China actually had abortion bans for a lot of the same reasons that the Tokugawa Japan did, for the kind of tax reasons thing. It's not similar to Japan, really clear how this all worked, and it's pretty clear that in practice, elite women could get abortions, because they very rarely had kids. They would, like, part of the job of the concubine in the Chinese system before the modern era, or before the 20th century, was to like offload the child process onto concubines so that wives didn't have to deal with it. So it's clear the wives had access to abortion. But anyway, the Chinese law being used here is just ported over directly, and it says, should any adulterer or adulteress conspire to commit double suicide, whether the adulteress dies thereby but the adulterer survives or vice versa, the survivor in either case shall be liable to suffer third-degree exile. If an adulterer conspires with an adulteress to administer drugs in order to cause an abortion, and the adulteress is killed in consequence of that act, the adulterer shall be sentenced to third-degree exile. The degree of exile is a Chinese punishment. It's like the degree of distance from your home. So first, second, third degree is 2,000, 2,500, or 3,000 li, which is, I converted this, 667, 834, 1,000 miles, or 1,070, 1,340, or 1,600 kilometers. So if you do an abortion bad and kill the person you are trying to help get the abortion, you get exiled. That's the law.
So this is more like a medical malpractice issue than it is a moral issue with abortion.
Yes. There's, again, still in China that, like, that quote unquote moral concern, in that it's very immoral to not have more kids who will pay me more taxes. But yeah, very different moral concern from what you see in the West. But speaking of the West, in 1873, the legal code gets revised again, particularly to give more clarity around abortion law and to update the punishments. So moving away from the exile thing, for example, which is a bit old-fashioned, and towards this newfangled thing called prison. But even at this point, there's a great study of Meiji period abortion law by Kanazu Hidemi and Marianne Bugert, and they note that this still doesn't treat, like, this is not a law even that is criminalizing abortion a bit more, that establishes fetal personhood in the sense that you see it in the US. The punishment is different from infanticide, which is dealt with in the section in homicide and has much bigger punishments. Abortion still is not treated as as serious a crime. It's up to 100 days in prison rather than several years in prison.
So when you say it's a crime, who is being criminalized? Is it the person getting the abortion or the person administering the abortion drugs?
The law is initially not clear. There's a couple of clarifying cases in prefectural courts in Saitama and Shiga that establish that anyone who is involved in either helping cause the abortion or encouraging it is also guilty of a crime. But the crime really is not a moral one. It's a crime against the state, which, once again, wants the population to go up. Because in 1870, Japan's building a conscript military, it needs workers for its new industries, and it's trying to colonize places like Hokkaido and Okinawa, and eventually Taiwan and Korea. And so you need quote-unquote extra people to just load onto some boats and ship there and be like, all of this is yours now, don't worry about the people who are already here. So it's very much, again, like a state policy of just, we need more kids, not a moral policy.
Very interesting. Okay, so yeah, still we have not, we can really see things sort of sliding away from the West's increasing insistence that a fetus has personhood, whereas in Japan, we are definitely still going with the, excuse me, that is a future worker and a future soldier and future colonizer that you're taking from the state.
Absolutely. The criminal code does get revised again in 1880, and this time you see more of an influence of Western ideas about abortion, because this is the point where the government starts saying, well, we want to get the West to take us seriously and treat Japan as a civilized country, quote unquote. And so we're just going to try and westernize as hard as we can. And so for that round of revisions of the criminal code, the government hires a French lawyer whose name I'm going to butcher, Gustave Boissonade, I think is how you say that. But he's from the University of Paris. He's a lawyer. They hire him to help write the criminal code. And he in particular works with an expert on Chinese law named Tsuruta Akira to rewrite the 6 articles that deal with abortion that form the basis of the current criminal code in Japan. So those articles say, pregnant women who have an abortion by taking medication or by another method shall be punished with 1 to 6 months of imprisonment. People who carry out abortions by administering medication or by any other method, and those who, as in the previous article, cause the women to die, shall be punished by 1 to 3 years of imprisonment, so you still have that malpractice angle. Physicians and midwives who work in the medical profession and commit the crimes described in the previous article shall each be punished by 1 degree more. Those who threaten a pregnant woman or plan to cause her to have an abortion shall be punished by 1 to 4 years of imprisonment. People who act violently against a woman whom they know to be pregnant and cause her to have an abortion shall be sentenced to 2 to 5 years in prison. If it was not their intention to cause the abortion, the sentence shall be lighter. And finally, people who commit the crime of the previous article and cause the woman to sustain critical injuries or die shall be punished according to the measures in the articles about assault and battery. So this is a lot closer to a Western model.
This is actually very interesting because this is now getting into some legal issues which are actually currently being hashed out in various places around the United States today, which is if a fetus has personhood but also is dependent on the life of another person for survival, and you assault the person carrying the fetus, what crime have you just committed? For instance, if you kill a pregnant woman, is that 2 murders or 1 murder? This gets into some very thorny legal issues.
Yeah, and actually, we have some of the back and forth about how this was hashed out, and it's clear they were aware of this, actually. So Boisnod is a French Catholic who has a very kind of traditional view of abortion, really wants it strictly punished, argues for fetal personhood. And it's really Tsuruta Akira, that Chinese law expert, who pushed back against him. We have a quote from a letter he sent to Boisnod. Japan is a mountainous and poor country, and when poor people have many children, they are unable to feed them all of them because of their poverty. Couples sometimes decide to have an abortion because they have no choice, but if the woman dies and the husband is sent to jail for a long time, it is extremely problematic because someone has to take care of the children who are left behind. Therefore, I think a light prison sentence would be better. He also says later in the same letter that abortion has become a custom in Japan. There will definitely be people who carry out abortions without realizing it is a crime to do so.
Interesting. Okay, so even while attempting to criminalize abortion and specifically criminalize the person choosing to have the abortion, there's still kind of a worry that this new law might actually do more to destroy the family unit than continuing to allow abortion.
And again, I can't stress enough, all of this is about state power. We actually, like, the commentary on Article 330, which is the first of the abortion laws, makes that really clear. The commentary issued for judges alongside the new code says, abortion is similar to taking a person's life, but there is a big difference between someone who is already alive and a fetus that is still in the womb and does not yet have a place in society. It is not possible to know whether or not the child will really be born, and therefore we cannot consider abortion a crime of homicide. But if we leave it unquestioned, it may harm the country by bringing down the population, and therefore we must investigate abortion as a crime in the criminal code. So it's all about state power.
Interesting. Okay, so there's a very interesting part of that sentence, which was, it is not possible to know whether or not the child will be born. Walk me through the reasoning going on there. Is that it could have been a spontaneous miscarriage and we don't really know how to investigate that? Is it more of a philosophical question?
I mean, well, even in a case where, like, a pregnancy comes to completion, childbirth doesn't always go great. Infant mortality is a thing. So there is still this knowledge that, like, even a pregnancy that is not artificially interrupted for whatever reason, you have no guarantee that person will definitely, like, grow up to become a person in the sense we think of that, like, a member of society. Right? That's very much the thought process. Just medically, there's no guarantees of what's going to happen here. So it's not like if you kill a person who you already know has a position in society and you are, like, directly preventing them from living further. The fetus may or may not become a person. There's ambiguity there, so it's not the same thing.
Interesting. Okay, this is a very interesting and very sort of different angle of approaching the attempt to define whether fetal personhood is a thing.
Yes. And, the government, while it tries to ban abortion, does kind of also recognize its limited power to do so. What really makes a big shift in terms of bringing abortion rates down is actually something much less exciting, which is licensing requirements for medicine. The new state starts doing things like requiring a license from an accredited university to practice medicine, or requiring approval by the Ministry of Health and Welfare to be a midwife. And part of that is, of course, following the regulations of the government. And that's what actually succeeds in, like, that's why this works, where, like, the Tokugawa attempts to bring down abortion rates did not. Not because of, like, strict enforcement. Not a lot of people, from what I can tell, even went to jail for this. It's just a lot of, like, licensing.
Okay, I have a question. So, well, obviously, I would imagine accredited universities at this time are not specifically training doctors in methods of abortion. But I also have the question, when we start trying to track abortion rates, when things like this are happening, if you are an unlicensed medical professional performing abortions, one doesn't report one's figures on abortion to the government. You're making finger guns, which makes me think I'm onto something here.
Absolutely. And this is very much the issue. It turns out, shockingly, and I know many Americans will be startled to hear this, you can't actually ban abortion. All you can do is ban safe abortion. This is exactly the issue. Even when the criminal code gets revised again in 1907, which is the current version of the criminal code with a couple of post World War II changes, even when the penalties are made a little bit more steep, it's like, from what we can tell, there's very clearly ongoing ongoing practicing of abortion. The government is aware of that. It's like a known issue throughout the 20th century. It's just happening underground and unregulated, and therefore, clinics that are not guaranteed to be safe. I do want to also note that the final revision, the 1907 revision, which is more or less on what's on the books today, is also the first to insert what's called a health of the mother exception, basically allowing for abortion in cases where the pregnancy threatens the health of the mother, just as is the issue with the current United States. It does not define what that means, which makes it a huge issue. So, you hear that bandied around, health of the mother exceptions are what's important. You have to define what that means, and it turns out politicians aren't good at that. That's why doctors are a different job. Anyway, let's talk about the later years of Imperial Japan.
I am going to ask another question about religion here, because I am very curious, because I definitely grew up in an age of debate over abortion rights where a lot of politicians were making the assumption that God wouldn't allow a bad thing to happen without reason, which is a very specific religious strain of thought.
Yeah.
As far as I'm aware, Japan has a very different religious tradition than that. Is that the case?
The first of the noble truths: all life is suffering.
So yeah, very different logic of the likelihood of a pregnancy actually causing medical complications. Going into the legal code there.
The fact that this is very much, I think, a structure that's intended to enforce political power for the benefit of the government, I think makes for very different abortion laws. There is not really a religious tinge to this at all. With Shinto, obviously there's no defined theology, and the only way it really intersects with abortion is around blood taboos and like ritual purity. And with Buddhism, obviously there is this kind of notion that like it's not great when people die, I guess within some strands of Buddhism, others have more complicated relationship with that notion. But there's not really a notion that the universe is inherently good and bad things don't happen to good people. Like, I would be shocked to ever find a Buddhist who believed that. It seems very counterintuitive to the kind of core notions of the religion.
Okay, so we're in the late 1800s now, right?
Well, we're pushing up to the 20th century, baby.
I was going to say, we're about to enter a century where Japan is going to have a lot of need of good workers and good soldiers. So how is that going to go?
Yeah, so it turns out that exactly that, particularly in the 1930s and 40s, as the country starts to militarize, as the military comes to dominate politics, there is more of a push to take abortion criminalization seriously. I do also want to note that Japan's first wave feminists, up until this point, are very involved in fighting for abortion access alongside voting rights. Those are kind of the two main issues of first wave feminism in Japan. And so most of the kind of famous figures of early Japanese feminism, if you know the period, these are people like Majima Yutaka, Ishimoto Shizue, Abe Iso, Ichikawa Fusae, Hiratsuka Raicho. They all push for reform of the abortion law. But they are largely suppressed in the 30s as very much as part of this demand for more soldiers, more workers, more colonizers. Abortion is definitely accessible during this period. It's just illegal, so it's hard to access and expensive and not very safe. Because again, banning abortion doesn't work. You can just ban safe abortion. There's even actually ads in newspapers for what are clearly abortifacients, things that like are intended to cause miscarriages, to terminate pregnancies. They just make use of euphemisms like, "Oh, this medicine will end a woman's monthly trouble," or "induce a monthly discharge." Like very much language that's kind of euphemistic, but it's clear what it's meant. And they're also usually not very safe or effective, but they're great at making money for assholes by preying on desperate people.
And how is the general conversation about birth control in Japan going? Are they, because I know a lot about how this conversation goes in America, because there's a lot of pushback against spreading information about birth control, which is getting significantly more reliable during this period than it was in the past, especially barrier methods getting way better. How is that going in Japan?
So there's no pushback against like condom instruction, for example. But that probably also has to do with it being a country where prostitution's legal. So, just for certain enterprising fellows who like to socialize in their spare time, but don't want to have to deal with anything that might arise from that.
This was also a country that had a horrific syphilis epidemic at one point, right? In the
That is
recent
that is
past.
true.
Yeah.
Yes, syphilis was an issue in the 18th and really into the 20th century. And actually, in terms of like discussions of birth control, the government doesn't promote it. Obviously, they want you to have lots of kids because they can then conscript those kids and send them to go to China. But there's not like an attempt to suppress this either. There is a lot of kind of public discourse around the subject, which brings me to the fascinating story of Shiga Akiko. So, Shiga Akiko is in the 30s a movie star. She's the child of a middle class family who basically was like, I don't want to be a housewife, which is what her parents wanted for her. And so she ran off to go into show business. And she was apparently very good. She was very popular and had a bunch of breakout roles starting in 1930. But then in 1935, there was a big scandal where a member of the Yakuza was arrested for involvement in an abortion ring. There was one of the very rare investigations into this. And he revealed that he had arranged 2 different abortions for Shiga Akiko. One of them was to a man she'd met at a bar in the Ginza in Tokyo while she was working to support herself. The other was with a fellow actor and director named Abe Yutaka. Both of them were single. The first man was widowed, the second was divorced. Both had made her promises around marriage before they became intimate. And then she got pregnant and they dumped her. And within 10 days of this coming out in public, she publishes this very heartfelt, like, public letter. A confession is what she called it. Basically saying that she felt pressured into having a relationship because without a male patron, and especially in the second case, a director who really loves you, it's hard to make it as a movie star. And she also knew that the men were not going to financially help her when she got pregnant and didn't have the resources to take care of a kid. So she felt pressured to have an abortion because otherwise she'd lose her job. And this doesn't work in terms of kind of protecting her. She gets a 3-year suspended sentence for violating the abortion law in 1936, which is lighter than what's mandated, but it still destroys her career. There's no sentence, from what I can tell, for any of the men involved, despite the fact that they at least tacitly appear to have encouraged the abortions. There is a public discourse around their responsibility, but no sympathy for her, no investigation of them. One thing, so the scholars Yasuko Tama and Scott O'Brien wrote a great article on abortion in this period and noted that it's kind of seen as a class issue at this point, where like women who are rich have access to abortion because they're the only ones who can afford the costs involved. And so there's kind of this sense of class envy of the attacks on Shiga Akiko. Like, oh, she thinks she's rich and the law doesn't apply to her like it does to the rest of us. And that's really where a lot of the aggression going against her is coming from. So there is this kind of like public back and forth here, but it's very much still the logic of the state, and then the logic of how dare anyone try to break the law. Basically, how dare you do that if I can't do that?
So it's more about a scandalous movie star behaving scandalously than it is about any particular moral outrage of she has taken a life.
Yes, it's more about the scandal of like she specifically has behaved poorly, not what she did, but more just the fact that she did it. Yeah, abortion is still largely tacitly tolerated. It's not aggressively prosecuted and is kind of treated as like an open secret, when it's not unavoidably thrust into the public light until 1941. In that year, the Japanese government starts a little bit of a war with the United States. You might have heard of it. And also develops a massive new policy to increase its population to further its colonial goals. The state develops a policy to grow the population by an additional 30 million people, from 70 million to 100 million in 20 years. With every family, the target is supposed to be they have 5 kids.
Oh boy, 5 kids is a lot. And 5 kids in immediate post-war Japan is a lot.
This
more,
is warrior Japan too.
Warrior Japan, and then into post-war years. That is a lot of mouths to feed in a place where food is very scarce.
So this produces a really kind of weird political fusion, you might call it, because, like, for example, I want to quote here. There's a health and welfare ministry official, Ito Kiyoshi, who says in 1938, "Children are the national treasures that constitute the foundation of the state. Producing children, the successors to the great endeavors of the state, and fostering and sustaining their good character is vital for our country. This momentous issue should be resolved through the thorough protection of maternity and children."
Interesting. That's a very different tack than a lot of other countries, which are currently going through their own very complicated rethinking of childhood as a concept. They don't go down the maternity road in terms of thinking about what to protect.
Absolutely. And so you get this really weird political outgrowth where, on the one hand, the law is updated to be even more strict, basically banning abortion under any case other than like serious health defects of the child. Basically, if this kid is not going to be useful for the state, then you can have an abortion. But other than that, no.
Oh boy, that is
eugenics is the word.
Yeah, that's a whole suitcase that we probably should unpack. I don't know how much time we have there with disability rights in Japan.
Well, that's a whole other thing, but I'll just tell you they copied the text of this law from the Nazis, and I think that tells you pretty much everything you need to know.
Oh boy.
So, but the flip side of this is that the government also passes a bunch of laws to, like, subsidize women who are pregnant and offer them, like, legal protections. And they do this in alliance with a lot of Japanese feminists, many of whom end up, during the war years, out of patriotism, saying, like, we have a lot of issues with this government. It's done things like blocked black women's voting rights, but they're willing to give us a thing we do want, which is like maternity protections for women. And that's something. And so, to quote the language of Ichikawa Fusae in Josei Tembo, or Women's Outlook, let us endure our sadness and suffering and stand by the posts that women should defend. Becomes the policy of a lot of Japanese feminists because they're getting something.
I am curious, does Japan go through sort of the same situation that a lot of Western countries go through, where so many men are off at war that there's some kind of unexpected feminist gains from the fact that women are moving into positions of power?
In terms of the economy, my understanding is yes. In terms of most other fields, no. In terms of like social policy, it's a very illiberal state. But then things go real weird really quickly again, because in 1945, the war ends very quickly, and suddenly the situation is very, very different. Food insecurity is a major issue. One of the ways that the US tries to win the war is by blockading and mining a bunch of Japanese ports, so there is not enough food for everyone. And the population is going back up because a bunch of people are being repatriated from the former colonies. 6 million people in 2 years. And as a result, there actually is a like resurgent push for birth control after in the immediate post-war period. A lot of that is just purely economic. There's kind of this growing concern about there's a great language from the Mainichi Shimbun about the country sinking under its demographic weight, as from that's from from the editorial board. And so to avoid that, everyone's really poor now, the country's in shambles, there's not enough food. Abortion controls need to be liberalized and birth control needs to be promoted. And there's definitely demand. The Ministry of Health and Welfare ran an internal report in 1948 that found that a quarter of its employees had gotten an abortion at some point, or their partner had gotten an abortion, largely from health concerns.
Oh man, that is actually, I mean, admittedly, this is a time period where there probably were slightly less effective methods of birth control available, but a quarter during this period known to have had abortions, I think is pretty high.
And willing to admit it too, because technically the government is like not enforcing abortion law, but they didn't repeal the criminal code. Like it is still illegal.
Yeah.
There's also a big upsurge, and this is, I mean, I think some of the darkest shit we're going to talk about in child abandonment during this period. If you are familiar with the film Grave of the Fireflies, that's not quite how it happens in the movie. I think the parents die, but kind of that vibe. There's actually a really grim child abandonment case where a hospital run by a midwife named Ishikawa Miyuki is found to have essentially like taken in kids. What they would do is go to families that couldn't afford kids, say like, pay us less than the cost of it would take you to raise this kid and we'll take care of them. And then pocketing the money and essentially neglecting them. And this was discovered when Tokyo police are on patrol and they find a bunch of children's remains.
Yikes.
It's pretty messed up. Yeah, she ends up not getting convicted of murder, which is pretty fucked up. Only 5 counts of child abandonment, and only gets 8 years. And her husband, who helped her, only got 4. And then she became a real estate agent. So...
Okay, that is fucked up. I'm also going to say something else very fucked up that is also a spoiler for the new Godzilla movie. There is a plot involving a child without parents in that movie, and I am now very curious about some of the politics going on behind the choice to include that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to unpack there. Maybe we'll talk about it on Patreon at some point.
Perhaps we will.
So as a result of all of this, and actually really the Ishikawa Miyuki scandal pushes this along, in June of 1948, the post-war Diet, the parliament, votes on the Yusei Hogoho, or eugenic protection law, which is a revised version of the old wartime, basically Nazi eugenic laws. And it's still doing eugenics pretty hard, honestly. But it does begin to set out more cases where abortion is allowed, particularly around health concerns for mothers, particularly if they don't think they'll be able to safely deliver a child. But it's also pretty fucked up. The original version of the bill was written by a socialist woman, Kato Shizue, and that included things like economic hardship as a reason to have an abortion. That one got shelved, and instead you got one that also let the government forcibly sterilize people if they decided you had bad genetics.
Oh, yikes. That was actually something that I should have probably asked about earlier in this episode, because there's actually kind of 2 sides to abortion rights, one of which doesn't actually get talked about very much. One side is the legality of choosing to have an abortion. The other side is choosing not to have an abortion when the government is trying to force one on you, because that is also something that can happen in circumstances like this.
And it did happen. There's actually an interview I found with a man who was using a cover name. What's the word for that? But he went by Kita Saburo in the interview, who was in a orphanage in the 50s and was sterilized without his knowledge. Because he was labeled a juvenile delinquent, and he didn't find out until decades later. So that's cool.
A lot of countries that have a history of doing that will specifically target their ethnic minorities. Is that what Japan is doing, or is it
No,
trying
just
to
antisocial types.
Okay, just
quote
generally
unquote.
antisocial types. The sort of the idea that eugenicists had that there was sort of like the perfect human that you could breed your population towards.
Exactly. And the law also establishes this whole review board system for managing abortion. These boards are called eugenic protection commissions set up in the different prefectures, staffed by doctors, lawyers, prosecutors, and social workers chosen by the government. Um, that system does not prove very popular. It has a bunch of pretty bad scandals very quickly. Particularly, there's a big case in Kyoto where it's revealed that a man is selling fake abortion drugs and then redirecting women to a doctor friend who will perform illegal abortions on them. And the local Eugenic Protection Commission really waffles on coming down on the doctor and the scammer, and that produces a lot of pretty intense backlash that sees the law revised the next year. This new version it does allow for abortions when the mother's physical condition or economic circumstances meant that continuing the pregnancy or giving birth would endanger the mother's health. So that does create a shift where now there is an economic rationale for abortion, but it is still controlled by the government. You still have to get a procedure done by a government approved doctor who is given training in how to apply the law. And the part of the law criminalizing abortion in 1907 is never actually repealed. There's generally also a big government campaigns to convince families to have two kids and to use condoms and other forms of birth control during this period, and that will eventually bring the abortion rates down pretty substantially. They peak in the mid 50s and start to go down in the 60s, and really level out starting in the 70s.
Isaac, are you suggesting that abortion is actually a pretty physically unpleasant form of birth control and that people who have better options available will take those instead?
Well, I don't know. Horrifically invasive medical procedure that leaves you feeling like crap, or just put a little hat on it. Which one's harder? I don't know. Yeah, and from what I can tell, the government also just kind of stops prosecuting people for abortion after a certain point. I went digging through the Japanese Supreme Court to see what I could find. The last case I could find dealing with abortion rights was from 1957, trying to prosecute a doctor for giving an abortion. And the Supreme Court threw the case out, actually, on the grounds that the doctor had to make a judgment call alongside the patient. It wasn't their job to try and deal with that. Their job was just to prevent flagrant abuses of the existing law, was the phrasing.
Interesting. Okay. So I'm sort of thinking through the what's going on in America around this time as we head into sort of the Roe v. Wade era. And that comes out of some actually very strange legal reasoning involving our medical privacy laws. It sounds like Japan is going down a very different legal path to reach sort of the same thing in practice, but completely different logic for how it gets there.
Yeah, it's very much still this kind of structure of like it's a health issue and like the government has this right to involve itself in your health. I do want to note that there are right to life conservatives in Japan. They are very, very small. They do try and change the abortion law in the 70s, but fail. Partially, this is a group led by Japanese Catholics, astonishingly enough. But the other wing is an absolutely, well, you know what? I don't care if I sound judgmental. An absolutely insane new religious movement called Seicho no Ie, or the House of Life.
Oh, tell me more about this.
I have sent you their website, actually, their English language website, if you'd like to take a look.
I am so excited to see everything about their graphic design. Oh, it's loading. Oh, boy.
I think they're just weird Christian syncreticists, but I can't really tell. I don't.
Okay, Christ is mentioned on this website.
Yeah, they called their founder Reverend Taniguchi.
Okay, they do some kind of faith healing because they claim to be able to cure cancer and tuberculosis with miraculous healing.
Oh, that seems normal. They have a thing that says environmental policy, and then it's just a link to 2 PDFs. They've implemented an environmental management system. Okay. I guess they like the environment, but they hate women's rights.
They, for some reason, they're really into making like Hawaiian style lei. I don't know why.
Weird new religions in Japan get strange sometimes. I'm saying weird a lot. That's judgmental, but I stand by it.
And they like bicycles. Okay.
I mean, who doesn't love bicycles?
This is a very strange collection of kind of a hodgepodge of things that would be on the far left and far right by American standards. I'm not really sure that you can categorize it by American standards.
I mean, from what I can tell, like politically, they're mainly constituents of the LDP, the like governing conservative party, but also everyone is because all the opposition parties are train wrecks. And they have like an LDP caucus which tried to change the abortion law, but it failed miserably. And from what I can tell, there was no political blowback for the LDP for that. Because, again, it's the LDP. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? Vote for the socialists? I dare you. Throw your vote away. Kang and Kolos are the only choices. I think that was the name from the Simpsons. Yeah, that's a deep cut for a couple of 90s Simpsons fans.
So, I have some questions here because on one hand, I am aware that Japan has fairly strong, at least on paper, protections of gender equality on paper. In practice, it's complicated, but on paper, fairly strong. However, I'm also very aware that the ruling party is getting increasingly concerned about declining birth rates. So, where has the conversation about abortion gone?
So, once again, it's complicated, but there is a big shift in the 90s. Really, two big shifts. And that's because in 1993, the LDP does briefly lose control of the government, and it won't regain it fully until 1996. And so while that's happening, in 1994, there's a UN conference in Cairo on population and development. The Japanese delegation that goes is from the governing coalition. It's mostly left-wing. And they mostly talk about the eugenics law that leads to a lot of international condemnation of the eugenics law because it's pretty fucked up. And so a bill is introduced in 1996 by the LDP once it gets back into power, as it's trying to like prove, no, we're cool. We're not the old LDP. We're the cool LDP. You know, you should vote for us again, even though we slightly fucked up the country a little bit, but don't worry about it. And this new, like, revised law sets some new rules around abortion, specifically the revised motherhood protection law is what they call it. This is the old eugenics protection law, but they changed the name. Says the object of this law is to protect the life and health of the mother by defining the rules with respect to sterilization and the artificial interruption of pregnancy. And it bans the whole eugenic sterilization thing, and forced sterilization is made illegal. And the only reasons you can sterilize someone are now health related. Abortion is also supposed to be health related only in cases of like threat to health.
Are vasectomies and getting your tubes tied illegal in Japan under this law, even if it's a procedure you completely consent to?
I actually would have to check. I would assume that falls under like your health, because health is also defined for abortion as like economic distress. Like if it would fuck your life up to have a kid.
Okay, that's again a very unusual route of sort of getting philosophically and legally to a place that I recognize.
Yeah. The concept here is basically like anything that could harm someone, with harm being defined not just as like the pregnancy goes badly, but like you financially can't afford it, which is kind of a legacy of that debate in the 50s about trying to like bring birth rates down.
Yeah, but like what if you're like middle class, you have a kid, you could afford another kid, but you would like to get your tubes tied?
My understanding, and I'm not sure, I'd have to double check, is that it is legal but comparatively uncommon. And Japan's in a really weird place with this right now. Technically, abortion is still illegal in Japan. The 1907 Criminal Code was never revised, but you also have this separate law that allows for abortion, and you have this whole licensing and permitting system controlled by the government, where there is a lot of leeway for doctors in how they interpret this. There's also some kind of weird stuff where, for example, if you're married, you do need your spouse's permission to get an abortion. But even when you're not married, doctors will often require patients to get consent from a partner, and there's no way to force them not to do that. Like, there's not really a way the government can step in and make someone give an abortion. It's very much if you get the training from the Ministry of Health and Welfare, it's then your judgment call.
I'm also curious, sort of on a practical level, how easy is it to leave Japan if you would like to have a procedure done in another country? Because I know that there's medical tourism for some other types of procedures. Is that something that anyone is tracking or aware of, or is there just no practical way to track that?
I don't actually know. I bet there's data on it, but I don't know how accurate it would be for exactly that reason. It'd probably be worth it, because one of the other things is that even like, unless it's a threat to your life, abortion is usually not covered by insurance in Japan, and the average cost is about 3 times as high. The average abortion in America is $580. In Japan, it's $1,500.
Ooh, that is quite high, especially for a medication abortion. That is very high.
That's because Japan didn't approve medical abortion pills, mifepristone and misoprostol, until April of last year.
Oh my God! So they were doing
surgical
surgery
abortions
for everything.
Until
oh boy,
2023.
That's
it also,
rough.
Fun fact, took 40 years until 1999 for oral birth control to get approved in Japan. How long do you think it took Viagra to get approved in Japan?
Oh, a lot less time than that.
9 months. So that's fun. Also, Plan B just got approved for use on a trial basis in June of 2023. So, it's grim. And I really want to note that, like, this weird hodgepodge that exists in Japan, it's not based on religion, right? This is not Christian fundamentalism like you see in the US. It also has nothing to do with public support. I found a Pew poll from this past year, from 2023, on the question, should abortion be legal or illegal in all or most cases? So the two numbers are percent who think it should be legal in all or most cases, percent who think it should be illegal in all or most cases. Just to give you some samplers here, would you like to guess what the numbers are for the US?
Oh, man. I'm going to guess like 60-40 maybe?
Very close, 62-36. Right? Turns out, by the way, abortion is largely supported in the United States. Most people think it should be legal in most cases. And so in a democracy, that should fucking mean something. Comparatively speaking, South Korea is 68-30, legal, illegal. Germany and the United Kingdom are 84-14. Japan, would you like to guess?
I'm going to guess like maybe 80-20.
Exact 81-12. Right? So 7% saying no opinion, right? But overwhelming support on the same level as like in Europe. And yet you still have this system in place. Really, the issue is, I mean, from what I can tell, that the parties, the political system, the state bureaucracy, all of the existing NGOs that deal with health are hugely male dominated. Japan has an insane gender gap. The World Economic Forum ranked Japan 116th out of 156 countries in 2022, and it then fell to 125th in 2023, which is the lowest in every country in the G7. Italy is the next lowest at 63. And then every other country in the G7, so that's the US, UK, France, Germany, Canada, are between 10 and 27.
Woof.
So it's bad. 9.7% of Japanese parliamentarians are women. 10% of government ministerial positions are held by women. There still has not been a female prime minister. None of the parties that I know of currently has a woman running it, so I don't think that'll change anytime soon. One of my favorite grim facts is that up until pretty recently, I can't remember if it was Kishida Fumio or his predecessor, Suga Yoshihide, who had there's like a ministerial post in the government that's something like Minister of, I think it might just be like women's issues or something like that, which was held by a woman who essentially complained, I don't have enough power to accomplish anything. Like, I'm told to do things like fix the birth rate and, try and get the gender pay gap a little bit better, and I don't have the power to do it. And she got fired and replaced with a man.
So, on the topic of women's jobs, I'm actually very curious. I understand that our generation in Japan has been having some hard conversations about things like work culture and the absolute impossibility of raising a family in the current economic system. Has this gone into the abortion debate at all, or is abortion considered sort of a minor factor in comparison to the overall issues with dating and actually finding housing and stuff?
My understanding is that right now abortion is not seen as much of an issue in terms of the birth rate, except for the fact that anyone with a brain can see it's the same root cause, which is a geriatric out of touch government that is not willing to make the hard choices necessary to actually fix the issue. I do also want to I don't want to leave behind the position of government involvement or women involved in government before I note the Japan's rate of female participation in politics. Again, 9.7% of parliamentarians are women. Would you like to guess what countries it is roughly statistically even with in terms of that?
Ooh,
The four closest.
oh boy. I'm gonna say maybe Russia, Korea. Uh,
Now, to be fair, I think South Korea might be worse, actually. No, it's Kuwait, Qatar, Fiji, and Myanmar.
oh boy, I was in completely the wrong part of the world.
Yeah, it's rough. So basically this just creates a really like paternalistic and frankly not like educated conversation around like women just at all, which I know is ironic coming from me. This is a guy doing this episode. But the moral of the story, I would say, is listen to women and let, involve them in policy making about their lives, which is shocking. But that hasn't happened right now. Here's an actual quote from the head of the Japan Society for Obstetrics and Gynecology, an old man named Kimura Tadashi. I'd like to think we as a society are mature enough to handle the over-the-counter purchase of Plan B, but in reality, we're not quite there yet.
Oh, wait,
What the fuck does that mean?
What does he think that people would possibly abuse Plan B to do?
I like the mature thing makes me think they're gonna walk up to the counter and be like, Plan B means somebody fucked. Like they're middle schoolers.
Yeah, what, like, I don't understand what level of maturity he is implying that society's not reached yet.
I think the maturity of letting people make their decisions rather than allowing Kimura Tadashi to make them for them. So yeah, Japan's fucked up politics are what I see as most of the issue with this weird hodgepodge system, where abortion is possible but still technically illegal, but regulated by the government even though it's illegal.
Interesting. Okay, so this is, yeah, a completely different system legally than what the US system deals with when it sets a precedent and when it has a law that is considered in effect. So it's ended up in a situation where, compared to some areas, actually fairly liberal on abortion, but has done it by creating an absolute legal mindfuck.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the subject, I'd say at this point, Japan's position on abortion legally is more liberal than like the American South, but less liberal than like the East Coast and the West Coast. Right. And that's despite the fact that as a country, abortion rights are way more popular in Japan than they are in the US. Oh, I forgot one more fun women in politics fact in Japan. So there are currently a record number of women in Japan's cabinet. There are 24 positions in the cabinet. How many do you think women hold?
Oh, I'm going to guess around 3.
You're too cynical. 5.
5? Oh, a whole 5.
It's a new record. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what, 20%? No. Is that right? Yeah, 20% ish.
I'm just a woman. I can't do math.
And that's how we got canceled. So, abortion law in Japan is interesting and weird, and has merely reaffirmed all my priors that you can't really keep people from getting abortions, so you should just regulate it and make it safe. And if you don't like that they're getting abortions, That's fine. Support people economically and make it easier for them to like keep their kids.
Yeah, have there actually been any recent cases at all of attempted prosecutions for illegal abortions, or even any kind of precedent of this is how we know that a pregnancy was ended and was not a spontaneous miscarriage?
I haven't found any. I'm not obviously super plugged into like the modern Japanese legal world. That's just going on Google News and throwing some terms in Japanese and English. Um, so I couldn't find any instances of prosecution. That doesn't mean they haven't happened. I'd be surprised if many did, simply because, from what I can tell, the attitude of a lot of the men running the country is just they don't give a shit one way or another.
Yeah, I mean, just this is something that drives me absolutely insane about the current state of the abortion discussion in Japan, because a huge number of pregnancies will naturally end in miscarriage. I think the number might be 1 in 4. I don't know that off the top of my head, especially because we can chemically detect pregnancy so early. There's a lot of weird shit going on in the United States with attempting to prosecute people for a thing that the human body does like a lot. I'm curious whether Japan has even attempted to wade into those waters.
I don't know that there's a legal position on that, but I'm not an expert, to be clear. This is just a fun week of research that I did. So, with all that said, if anyone would like to find information about how they can join Seicho no Ie and cure all their diseases through meditation and also become a weird social conservative, where can they find us?
Well, you definitely cannot find that on our website, but if you would like other information about
We're not linking to the website in the show notes?
Okay, I will link to that website in the show notes. I was going to say, if you would like to find other information about the history of Christians who think they can do magic in Japan, you can
that is a theme actually for us.
You can find more episodes about that on our website, facingbackward.com.
And you can support us doing this weird research at patreon.com/facingbackward, where you too can help financially support our ability to go on weird tangents about things that I find on JSTOR one day.
And special thanks to our patrons who pledged at the shout-out tier. You are Yan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCullough, Kieran Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William, Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Harushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, an anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sy, Gil, Leslie Akuda, Trash Taste Enjoyer, John, Christopher, Harrison Reese, Inoue Enrio's Ghostbusters, NihongoKaizen.com, Shimao Toshio's History of Japonesia podcast. A house is a perfectly cromulent mascot. The fish I catch are Rhodes Scholars compared to Samuel Alito, who remains, as always, a schmuck. And everything changed when the Fire Nation attacked.
On this of all things, man, what a schmuck. Until next time, folks, remember that Confucius says we need more taxpayers.
Yeah, next time I will get back to what I said I was going to do this week and then got derailed from, which is talking about when you have an excess population instead of not enough population, where you're going to warehouse them.
Oh man, talk about an argument for birth control. Otherwise,
prisons.
you end up with Australia. Oh, that too.
Oh, this is about what happens when Australia stops being an option, but we will cover that next time.